You had mentioned this name before, George Disling. Who was he? What role did he play? And how active were Nazi officials in Germany vis-a-vis what was happening in Los Angeles?
All right, let's start with the latter part.
Yeah.
Both Adolf Hitler and his Reichsminister of Enlightenment and Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, both agreed that, first of all, both loved the movies, and both agreed that part of the success that the Allies had in World War I was their ability to put out enormous propaganda against Germany, both coming out of British studios and American studios. And they believed that that propaganda, those anti-German movies, were enough to help sway people who were on the line. Should we support Germany? Not, yes, no. That those turned the tide against the German nation. And they were determined to stop Hollywood from making any anti-Nazi, anti-German, anti-Hitler films. And so they sent their vice consul, George Gissling, who had been in New York, they sent him to LA with one mission and one mission only, which is forget about everything that a council does. You can do those things on the side. We don't care. What we want you to do is stop Hollywood from producing any film that mocks, denigrates, attacks the German government, the German people, and particularly Adolf Hitler. And they empowered him with the German Economy Act of 1931 that said any studio in the world that puts out a film that is an anti-German film, and by that, again, attacking, mocking, in some way denigrating Germany and its leaders, would have all its films banned in Germany. And if a nation put out enough of those kind of films, or allowed those films to be made, the entire export would be banned from Germany. Well, Germany then was the number 2 market after England, and it was a very important market for the Americans. And so when Gissling came over, he basically came to LA and he told the studios, there's a new marching order here, and I need to see your films. And if you don't show me your films, those films will be banned from Germany. And what people need to understand is Hollywood is first and foremost in the money-making business, not the consciousness-raising business. And if producers and directors could make films that raised consciousness while making profits, great. But the bottom line was the bottom line. And so every studio except for the Warner Brothers, who told them to go take a hike, and they shut down their offices in Berlin and moved elsewhere in Germany, every other studio agreed to let Gissling see its films. He, in fact, saw many of those films, ordered certain cuts, certain censor cuts, which they all agreed to make. And then his job got a lot easier in July 1934, when Hollywood, which was under attack for producing films that many people thought were filled with too much violence, too much sex, too much immorality, they passed what was called the Production Code Administration. And the Production Code Administration passed a new self-censorship code, and they had Section 10, which mirrored the same thing Germany had in their Economy Act, saying, if you want to get a production code seal, then you cannot make a movie that attacks, mocks, or in any way denigrates a foreign nation or its leaders. And those seals were essential because you needed a seal to get into a first-run movie theater, and studios made 80% of their profits in the first-run movie theater. So from 1934 until he left the country, when Roosevelt expelled all German diplomats in June 1941, Gissling would be locked away in studio rooms, watching these movies, ordering cuts, and the studios had to agree with those cuts or else they would lose the German market.
You clearly document in the book that there were serious threats in the West Coast from Nazis, Nazi supporters, fascists. At what point did law enforcement agencies locally and perhaps the FBI nationally take any of these threats serious?
Oh, how about 1941, the fall of 41? For any of your listeners who have not seen or listened to, rather, the Rachel Maddow series, Ultra, Rachel Maddow Presents Ultra, she does a great job of showing how it really is until there is sabotage on the East Coast in the fall of 1941, where 3 munitions plants are blown up. And one of them, the Hercules powder plant, had been blown up. And 2 years earlier, in 1939, one of Leon Lewis's agents exposed himself by testifying before HUAC and saying, you know, I had been undercover, I had been part of this Nazi group, and we were planning to blow up the Hercules powder plant. The only difference is they were planning to blow it up on the West Coast, where there was one, and this one blew up on the East Coast. And even after the powder plants blew up, J. Edgar Hoover kept saying, no, 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 this is just an accident, it's not sabotage. And it wasn't until Leon Lewis and Joe Roos, his assistant, sent Walter Winchell as well as Drew Pearson and other journalists all this information, all their spy reports about the sabotage that was actually going on, about Neil Ness and his testimony, that they published articles that embarrassed Hoover so much, saying, here are all these Nazis. There are 1,800 Nazis working inside aircraft factories in America, in Los Angeles, rather. And the FBI is doing nothing about that. Nothing. And it embarrassed Hoover so much that he finally ordered his agents to start investigating. But by the time he ordered his agents, the FBI in LA had written Hoover in 1940, saying, look, we should put Hermann Schwinn, the head of the German-American Bund, under surveillance. He's the head of LA Bund, and he's the #2 Nazi in America. He's the Gauleiter for the entire Western region of the Bund, meaning all the West Coast through Hawaii. He is a dangerous man. We've gotten all these warnings about plots, et cetera, and Hoover writes back saying Hermann Schwinn has broken no laws and therefore he cannot be put under surveillance. What the letter never said is that a number of movie stars who were on the left, who had never broken a law, had been put under surveillance since 1918 by Hoover, starting with Charlie Chaplin. And throughout the 30s, he had movie stars under surveillance who broke no laws. But again, Hoover was obsessed with communists. He was also an anti-Semite and thought, you know, fascists and Nazis are no threat to America. They're white, they're Christian, they're not a threat. And he was forced into action. When I wrote away for the Freedom of Information Act file for Hermann Schwinn, again, the chief Nazi in LA, #2 Nazi in America, I eventually got his file, and the FBI file began in January 1942, after Pearl Harbor, not before.
You mentioned Charlie Chaplin, one of course, the great Hollywood stars, and we kind of associate Hollywood stars today with raising their voices on all kinds of political issues, civil rights, liberties, whatever it might be. Were they like that in the 30s, or were they put into check by the studios who were, again, concerned about market share in Germany and Europe?
Well, I'd say both. That first of all, when does Hollywood become political? And the answer is, the surprising answer is, it was the Republicans who established the first beachhead in Hollywood, not the Democrats. It was conservatives, not liberals. Louis B. Marin, 1928, turned MGM into a publicity wing for the GOP. And it wasn't until the 1932 presidential election that Hollywood as a whole became political, that you had movie stars who had never spoken out before on politics, particularly came out for FDR. And it was the first time the Democrats came out in large numbers. And within a few years, you had the Hollywood Democratic Committee and the Hollywood Republican Committee. And after the election, things went a little quiet, but by 1936, movie stars, both on the left, center, and conservatives to the right, Republicans, all joined the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. That becomes, I would argue, the first issue-oriented Hollywood intervention. You know, in the same way we're what I call issue-oriented politics. Movie stars can't engage in constant political activism because they're often on sets making movies. But in between that, they can speak out on issues that matter to them. And the first big issue that really confronted the movie industry stars was fascism and Nazism. And that's why in 36, they formed the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. They had parades in which movie stars marched at the front with banners. And whenever they marched, they put the most prominent movie stars at the front. And because photographers would take their picture, and they would be on the front page of every newspaper in the world the next day. So that was one thing that they spoke out for. But in many ways, it helped raise consciousness, but it didn't do a lot in terms of policy. Leon Lewis accomplished much more than all these organized anti-Nazi leagues did.
What would you say was Leon Lewis's greatest accomplishments in all of these endeavors that really span the entire war, 33 till 45, Hitler till the end of the war?
Well, you know, one of the responses I've had to the book, and when I've given talks sometimes, is people say, well, were these Nazis really a threat? Weren't they more Keystone Cops than anything else? And my answer is, do you really want to take a chance? That one of the remarkable things is there were no episodes of sabotage on the West Coast before or during the war. And largely, that is credited to Leon Lewis and his spies. His spies uncovered several murder plots. They uncovered a number of plots. The first one they uncovered, I mentioned before, the Silver Shirt plot by Dieter Gefgen, who was working with Silver Shirts and Nazis to take over the armories in LA, San Francisco, and San Diego. Well, Leon Lewis, the only one who would listen to him in 1934, was the head of naval intelligence on the West Coast, Zacharias. I forget his first name now. But Zacharias listened to Lewis in part because he was a Jew. He was one of the rare Jewish graduates at that time of Annapolis and was a high-ranking officer. And when Lewis notified him that Silver Shirts were buying weapons in San Diego from two corrupt Marines, no one else listened, but Zacharias did. He ordered an investigation and discovered everything Lewis said was true, that they were buying arms, they were plotting to overthrow the National Guard armories and take them over. And those men were in fact brought to trial and convicted. So Lewis, it isn't anyone. His greatest achievement was simply running a spy ring until the end of the war, because he believed that even after Pearl Harbor, he thought anti-Semitism was going to go up, not down, and he was right. And he was afraid that officials would not protect Jews during the war. And he was right about that as well.
What was the connection, if there was one at all, between the isolationist America First movement and American Nazi activity?
Right. You had two groups in the America First movement. The America First movement was essentially arguing as a whole, war has never solved any problems. World War I left everyone in worse shape than before, and that we should stay out of foreign wars. Europe is always at war. If you take a look at the history of Europe, there's always wars between nations. France, England, Spain, parts of the German Empire have always been at war with one another. It does us no good. Well, that was being articulated by two different groups. On one side, those I would call the genuine peace advocates, anti-war people, included people like the young John Kennedy, the young Gerald Ford, both joined the America First movement, neither of whom you could accuse of having fascist or Nazi sympathies. They just simply thought war is not the answer. But on the other side, there were many pro-Nazis who wanted to keep America neutral as long as possible. They knew Hitler was going to start a war. They didn't, and they knew that American intervention could prevent Hitler from achieving a rapid victory. And so they were trying to keep America neutral to the day Hitler was ready to start his war. And at one point, once he conquered Europe, they fully expect he would turn his vision and conquer the United States. So keep America neutral as long as possible. And he had agents like Sylvester Varick, who was his chief propaganda agent in America, working with American firsters, working with congressmen and senators to keep neutrality going as long as possible.
As you put the book put together, did all your research, what lessons do you draw from the activities of a Leon Lewis actively being involved in trying to stem Nazi activity, and the role that the Jewish community should play in American politics and in fighting anti-Semitism?
Well, that's there's an easy answer and it's a complicated answer, because the easy answer is a dangerous answer, which is Leon Lewis stood up when no government officials would stand up. And when you go back, I used to be a political theory major. And in terms of state theory, when you talk about Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, all these people who talk about the founding of civilization, there's one line of agreement. Now, mind you, it's philosophy, it's not law, which is when a government, the whole point of a government is to protect the lives of its citizens. When a government no longer is able to protect the lives of its citizens, that government becomes illegitimate. And it becomes the right of every citizen to mobilize for self-protection. And this is what Leon Lewis saw happening, that no one in government, he went to the police, he went to the sheriff, he was not trying to become a vigilante. He was not trying to seize power on his own, to run some extra legal operation. He was not the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. He was trying to work within the law. But when every single law enforcement agency basically told him to piss off, we don't care what happens to the Jews, Leon Lewis said, not on my watch. And the interesting lesson, we want to talk about lessons, it's about something well beyond the Jewish community, because with one exception, every one of his spies was a Christian. And every one of his spies knew Leon Lewis was a Jew. There was no question. And they knew the Jews were funding this, but they never felt they were working for the Jews. They were working for America, because they all believed that when one group of Americans calls for death to another group of Americans, it's up to every citizen to protect their fellow citizens, regardless of their race, their religion, or their ethnicity. And that, to me, is the real heroism. All these undercover operatives were risking their lives to stop Nazis from killing fellow Americans. And they weren't saying Nazis killing Jews, they were killing fellow Americans. And that's not what we do in our country. And so if there's a lesson, it's somehow every one of us needs to do something. And Moses Maimonides, in one of his commentaries, says, I don't ask you to be like Moses. I ask you to be like the best of yourself. And the way I understand that is, you don't have to be as heroic as Moses to lead a people out of the desert for 40 years. But what can you do? And to me, the answer is, at the very least, when an election comes, bring one friend with you who wasn't planning to go to the election. At the very least, help turn out a vote to get hate mongers out of office. The other thing, if you hear somebody giving hate speech, say something. That's a little harder to do. But if you hear it, say something. We don't talk that way in this country. That's not okay to talk like that. Now, mind you, if you're dealing with a crazy person, you do put yourself at risk. But it is something, and I would argue, if you do it in a venue where there are other people, you will not be isolated. Other people will stand up with you. In other words, anything you can do to fight back against hate, however small, is a move forward.
What's next in your work and your projects? Any project that you're undertaking now? Is it
Oh yeah, I'm about three-quarters
related?
Yeah, I'm three-quarters away through a follow-up book,
Okay.
because my Hitler in LA ends in 1945, but I knew Nazism and fascism in America did not end in 1945. And so I'm writing a follow-up book called The Secret War Against Hate, American Resistance to White Supremacy After 1945. And it's two simultaneous stories. I tell the story of four of the main godfathers of white supremacy, starting in 1945. The book, in a sense, asks us, how did we get from the end of World War II to January 6, 2021? How do we get from the good war and the greatest generation to the storming of the Capitol? And my argument is, we've all been misled by Tom Brokaw and this idea of the greatest generation in the good war. And that was true for probably the majority of troops who came back. Came back not believing in Kumbaya America, but I think they had a sense of salad bowl, that they had fought with people they never would have interacted with in their lives. The Jew, the Christian, the Catholic, the boy from New York, the Jew boy from New York, the Mississippi kid, the California kid, kid from Wisconsin. And they come back, I think, with a sense of appreciation of differences. And yet they all had each other's back. They were brothers in combat. And it isn't like they came back saying, I want you to marry my sister. But it's like, well, you know what? You deserve to lead a life free of harm and to lead a life wherever life takes you on your own abilities. That was only half. The story we never tell, and this is the story I've uncovered, is half the people who come back angry. Why? They didn't go to war to fight Hitler and Mussolini, to fight fascism and Nazism, to fight for democracy. They went to war simply because Japan bombed us. And when someone bombs you, you fight back. And they went to war as patriots, protecting their country. And these are people mainly in the old Confederacy, across the Southwest and parts of the Great Plains. And they come back and they argue our world's been changed. That while we were gone in these 4 years, Congress has passed all these laws making it easier for Blacks and Jews to compete with us for jobs and housing. And that before the war, we had no problem with Blacks and Jews because they knew their place. And as long as they knew their place, everything was wonderful. But now they don't know their place anymore because Congress has passed all these laws that make them think there are equals. And those people start creating a series of white supremacist hate groups bent on violence, murder, and destruction. And I follow four of those people. The one name that your listeners probably would have heard of is George Lincoln Rockwell. And the others are Emory Burke, Jesse B. Stoner, James Maydall, and Rockwell. And what makes these men so interesting is they work together for decades. These are movement activists. They're not just looking to influence an election. They want to change the whole country. And so the story is how the four of them work together and then fall apart because their egos, everyone wants to be the head white supremacist, the head Nazi in America. But the other story I tell is how three groups spy on them from 1945 to the late 70s. The Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, and the Non-Sectarian Anti-Nazi League are all running undercover operation, like Leon Lewis did, keeping track. And in the case of the Anti-Nazi League, putting agent provocateurs inside some of these groups who rise to positions of power and then foil them. It's a great story.
When is this coming out? When is it expected to come out?
After I finish writing it.
Okay.
I would say probably a year and a half.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to seeing it. And again, Hitler in Los Angeles, how Jews foiled Nazi plots against Hollywood and America, and urge all our listeners and viewers to simply go online and purchase the book. You'll find it educational, informative, and simply fascinating. Professor Ross, again, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks, Ari. I appreciate being on the show.